actually going to happen in this debate. Because half of their material is based on the premise that now there will be no assets that banks can invest in risky investments. That means that banks become less profitable. The other half of their material rests on the fact that because people can be so easily persuaded into equity accounts, there's still going to be a huge amount that people are going to be investing in these equity accounts, and banks will still get risky. These two things don't exist at the same time. I think probably they should weigh out which is more likely, but I'll do that for them and at the same time prove why we still think we get better regulation on our side of the house. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through some rebuttal to prove why a lot of the things that they said to you are either just asserted or nonsensical. And then I'll explain why what my partner told you is actually the most important stuff in this round. So, they say the reason why this doesn't have any political outcome is because this policy is not accessible. Now, yes, I think probably this policy, when you're explaining it to people, doesn't go into the nitty-gritty of like what a treasury bond is or what a government bond is, but like, I'm not an econ student. I probably know not that much about econ. That info slide was enough for me to understand what this policy is, right? I think that's the kind of stuff that a government can say when they're doing a particular policy. This bank has to put, unless you opt out, your money into less risky accounts. That's what you have to explain. That's what you have to tell these people for them to understand that this is the choice that they have. I think it's really demeaning for them to say that the people who are going to banks are so stupid that they cannot possibly explain what their banking alternatives is. Moreover, this gets into their analysis about how people don't understand competition, so they won't ever choose between banks. This was literally just an assertion. This was never actually proven. I think that lots of people look at the benefits that they get for particular accounts. Like lots of students choose which accounts have the best perks for being in a student account. Lots of people look at the interest rates that they gain on their savings. I really don't see why people have an incentive to not do this. Maybe they don't look at all of the banks. Maybe they don't look at every single one. But the likelihood is there are lots that are big that they will compare online when they look at the different accounts. And their incentive structure is within that. I'll prove why their incentives are to do that. It is because A, they want the highest amount of interest, B, they probably want the highest amount of payback, C, they want a bank that they know is reliable, a bank that is probably solvent, and lastly, they probably just want a bank that they know that they can trust, and the effort to go to that point is worth it because it is your savings, it is everything that you have, and that's why people are likely to put a huge amount of effort into this, and they need to do a lot of work to prove why they wouldn't. And then they say the risky half becomes more risky. Even if this is true, they need to prove that it becomes risky to the point where it offsets all of the benefits that we've already provided. Because I would posit, if risk still occurs, if people have consented to that risk, I am okay with that risk being something that happens, and I am okay with them existing in a situation where their assets are less safe. The problem that exists in the status quo is even if you would choose otherwise, you don't have the ability to choose because all banks invest in a majority of equity, so investments and giving out loans. I think furthermore, we get into closing POI, and I'm going to build it up a little bit more. There are lots of reasons why banks won't go beyond the amount of what is accessible risk. It is because should they go into things that are too risky, so let's say like buying really poor investments or giving out really risky loans, they are unlikely to get those loans back. People are likely to switch to safer banks, and when that happens, that bank is likely to be a lot less solvent than before. There are lots of reasons why they don't want to go into investments that are that risky. Getting into the diversification stuff that I imagine is going to come out in an extension, I think A, you're likely to still have a diverse amount of investments when, as Teju said, we're willing to say that you can invest in multiple governments, we're willing to say that you can invest in multiple areas, but more than that, I think it's just an assertion that they're going to invest in the riskiest of countries. Why would you invest in Venezuelan bonds when you can invest in like Brazilian bonds, or when you can invest in literally any other country's bond that's not going to go under? I think yes, there are bonds that are risky, but literally every country in the world pretty much is in debt. There are lots of bonds to choose from. There's lots of debt that you can buy. I just don't think that there's not a diversity in things that you can do. Then they say you force banks to be less profitable, and therefore they make more money by either asking for high interest rates on their loans, or B, doing the risky things, which I think I already explained. In terms of higher interest loans, I think this is a balance, right? Because there is a point at which giving out really low interest loans is a risk for that bank and is a risk to the people who take them. And I think is probably not something that we should support. This was a huge amount amount of what contributed to the 2008 financial crisis, which is that people who could not possibly pay back mortgages were taking out loans that they probably should never have taken. So I think if they stop giving out those kinds of loans, that's a benefit for our side, and that's something that we should support. But even if they have higher interest rates on loans, I still think that they've never provided any reason why that competition fails to a meaningful extent such that people are willing to accept those high interest rates. Maybe big banks probably don't want to have like really low interest rates. That's fine, that still is accessible to a lot of people. But even if between them they have to like expand into markets that are different, so one is higher interest rates and they get the people who are happy with higher interest rates, one is lower ones and they get the people who are happy with those lower interest rates, I really don't see why banks would compete for the same market when there are different ones that they could go to, and that makes them more profitable. I really don't see why you're going to have these really bad loans, and I really don't see why people are going to be disadvantaged in that way. I therefore think, yeah, why not?
The status quo is consumer choice because you can choose an ultra-safe investment if you want to. The question is, should the state shift the default to an account which for the overwhelming majority of investors would be a bad choice?
No, so consumer choice is not something that meaningfully exists. The average person doesn't have a financial planner that puts their money into like investment accounts that they can therefore get big returns on. The average person puts their money in a bank, and the average person chooses a bank to put their money into. If they want to prove a reason why now everybody's going to be able to afford like financial planners, good luck. Probably a little bit difficult to do. I think when banks therefore feel as though they are able to manipulate people into choosing risky assets because they have no other choice, that's probably really bad. I similarly think if their biggest problem is that because of the asymmetry of information, banks are able to lie to people to get them to go into these equity accounts. That's something that easily can be absorbed within a policy of regulation of banks and these accounts. We can make sure that they give this information out. But more than that, if nothing changes and people still invest in the same way because they don't choose non-equity accounts, their side of the house has no impact. But on our side of the house, the people who are the most worried, the people who crave the most security, do have a choice and do have the ability to switch to an account that makes them feel more secure. I think we get a better political system. I think we get people investing much better for their lives, and I think we still get a lot of functioning within these banks and the financial sector as a whole. Very proud to propose.
Will miss out on the good times. First, they never make it clear as to why banks would have an incentive to be obtuse. Yes, it's true that people might not understand the exact way in which interest rates are calculated, but banks could presumably go to consumers and say, what is your risk appetite? How willing are you to lose money? How constant a stream of withdrawals do you need from your bank account in order for you to be satisfied? And banks have the incentive to do that if it is the case that they want trust from their consumers, which is absolutely the case in the status quo. And secondly, it's not clear that the good times are worth it, because if you're a poor person with very few assets to invest in the first instance, the likelihood of even a small economic downturn is likely to lead to you losing a large portion of your savings. And if you only have $200 in the bank account and you lose 20% of that, that is potentially you losing the ability to feed your family. So even if they get more returns some of the time, those are not worth the harms that you put people through. Second argument to address is this argument about high interest rates. Now, opening government gives you the plausible response that you might offer different interest rates to different consumers, but the more plausible response is just that consumers have a limited appetite for risk and for expensive credit, which means that it's not profitable for banks to just jack up the interest rates, because it means that people will not take out those loans in the first place, and banks make those loans more risky by increasing the interest rate because it increases the rate of default, which is why that argument is absurd. Thirdly, on worse regulation, it is just not clear why people will just suddenly give up on regulating banks. Presumably they still find them untrustworthy to some extent, and just having this large regulation will not stop that. And I would note that argument is also contingent, because if we prove that this is a very good regulation that decreases substantially the amount of risk that banks face, then further regulation might be unnecessary. First point of extension is why this empowers governments to spend money on the lives of their people. First reason for this is that forcing banks to purchase large numbers of government bonds enables the large-scale transfer of liquidity from consumers living in those countries to the governments of those countries. But secondly, it makes it cheaper when governments seek out debt, because when every bank has to buy large portions of government bonds, it makes the yields or the interest rates on those bonds cheaper, because the market for bonds is more competitive, and that means that it's likely that, that it becomes cheaper for governments to take out debt in the future, because they're able to go to a bond market and offer a bond with a lower yield, and therefore making those bonds less expensive to take out. And thirdly, it enables banks to invest in a more diverse range of governments, which is, admittedly material that opening government gives you. But we would say it's not just government bonds, which seems to be the focus of the opening half of this debate. They can also diversify by sector. For instance, governments can, purchase, agreements to pass on the profits of state-owned enterprises, which is a thing that lots of developing countries do to fund infrastructure projects. And that means that those risks are spread out, but also it incentivizes governments to invest in a broader range of countries and to inject money into countries like developing countries that might not have had access to that capital before. Why is this good? It enables the large-scale transfer of money from individuals to governments who have incentives to spend that in a way that makes people more economically productive and that makes funding things like infrastructure projects better. But the second thing I want to address under this first head of extension is why government investments, such as bonds, are far better than the other likely comparatives that banks could invest in. Because opening opposition's first comparative is that banks must still invest in other things. They just have to invest in things like mortgage-backed securities or other things that might make them profits. There are a number of reasons why these are harmful, why government bonds are far better. Firstly, because they take a sample of the whole economies of countries rather than individual sectors, which is the likely case when you invest in things like mortgage-backed securities, which merely invest in the housing market, which means that the value of those assets is less prone to being devalued as a result of economic shock. Secondly, the reasons that governments have very good long-term incentives. No government, for instance, in Australia, wants to be responsible for Australia losing its AAA credit rating, which is why those government's assets tend to be way more stable than the incentives of a business, which knows that we can declare bankruptcy if things go wrong and start up again anew. Thirdly, the reason that electoral incentives mean that governments have incentives to not take out huge amounts of risky credit, because in populations of countries are naturally suspicious when they hear that their governments are taking out huge loans that make them subject to the will of other countries, which is why it is the case that governments tend to be less risky with their spending. Compare that to corporations, which often invest in, for instance, large-scale risks like building infrastructure that they don't know will necessarily become profitable, or like Uber, which is a multi-billion-dollar corporation that has not made a single cent of profit since its inception, and that is less risky. And finally, corporate governments have far larger capacity than corporations to restructure debt when things go bad, because they can use the large pools of assets that are in their control, the large amount of capital that they have in their control, to bargain for other forms of credit that help them restructure pre-existing debts, which is less likely to be the case with a corporation that has fewer assets, that might not have access to the same international capital markets that governments do. The other comparative, so that is why government bonds are far more secure than kind of the likely alternatives as set up by opening opposition. And that is the most important thing in this debate, for the reason that I've already outlined. That the scenario that happens when things like corporations default or when there's an economic crisis isn't just that people lose a few cents compared to a few dollars. It's that people lose the entirety of their life savings that are held in the banks of these banks. It's that people engage in runs on banks by trying to withdraw all of their money that makes them fail, and that's extraordinarily harmful.
Thanks for talking about the ease of accessing debt. You've explained the first part of our extension. Now you need to explain whether Algerian debt should be regulated and have due diligence from international banks, or whether they should be able to coerce Algerian citizens into financing any debt.
I honestly do not understand that point of information. Presumably there is some degree of coercion already. That coercion is less likely to be the case when Algeria has access to a wide variety of international banks that can compete for its bonds, so I do not understand what the point of that argument is. Finally, their other alternative is just having higher liquidity ratios. That's harmful for two reasons. Firstly, the money just sits in the bank and loses value over time, which means that money flows out of the economy. And secondly, it means that banks are far more likely to resist things like spending during times of crisis. Finally, this aligns the incentives of governments and banks, because currently banks have incentives to do things that make them short-term profit, that make governments more risk-prone, like having risky securities which fail and the required bailout, or deregulating the economy in a way that decreases the amount of tax revenue that governments have, which balloons the size of debts that government currently hold in a way that makes them more economically unstable. And they do so using the enormous lobbying power that they're able to derive from the fact that they hold in their accounts the billions and billions of dollars that the people of those countries hold. But banks clearly do not have an incentive to have government bonds fail, which is the case when government debt balloons out of control, which means they're less likely to engage in those sorts of risky behaviours or coercive behaviours that make governments more risky. That's what we propose.